So the focus of this is going to be we're going to do everything you're not supposed to do pedagogically. We're going to throw too many things at you way too fast and probably not give you much time to answer questions because our goal is to get this done in an hour and a half, but we have 11 events to talk about. And so this is exactly what it's advertised to be. This is an overview of events. We're going to tell you a little bit about each event. We're going to try to cover the events that happen in all 6 classifications. Megan and I are going to split that up. We're going to talk about them in categories because they kind of logically fall into about 4 categories. Interp and acting events, although that arguably could be 2 different categories. But we're going to group them together tonight. Book events, so events that you do with students do with a book in their hand. Prepared speaking events, and limited prep events. And I'm going to talk about interp and acting primarily and book events. Megan's going to talk about limited prep and prepared speaking events primarily, and we're going to probably drive each other crazy while we do that. Sound good to everybody?
Yes, okay. And Russ, I'm just letting you know, I may have to check out a little early. We're having a Christmas party downstairs, so.
Okay, well, there will be a recording.
Awesome.
For good or bad. Joe, absolutely, I'll hang around and do some questions. Okay. Okay, so with that in mind, let's see. Can you, I haven't shared my screen yet, have I? All right. All right, do you see this? You all see the forensics events slide? All right, so here we go. The first slide is just a link, and you can find this by going to the Acacia website. It is a link to all of so it's got each classification and their events, and then below that there's a list of topics for the limited prep events, for extemp, impromptu, U.S. extemp, domestic or international extemp, and impromptu. IDA doesn't have topics listed there, but that's because it's just a different thing that Megan's going to talk about in a little bit. Any questions about that? You can copy that, but literally, you just go to the Acacia page, go to speech and drama, and then over on the side, there's a thing that says classification, events by classification. I think that's the way it's labeled. Okay. All right, let's talk about interp and acting events. 5A and 6A call these events interpretation. And those events are humorous interp, dramatic interp, and duo interp. The counterpart to those events in 1, 2, 3, and 4A are humorous solo acting, serious solo acting. Where didn't it? Oh, you know what? It left off. Duet. So I guess I thought I had that in there. So the duet acting needs to be added to this slide. And so here's the common elements across all of those. And I'm going to go through these pretty fast because you're speech, theater focused people. All of these events are memorized. That was about structure. Almost all of them in terms of style have what we call a teaser. This isn't a rule, by the way. It's just stylistically the way it happens. You do what, Megan, 30 seconds to a minute, depending on the piece of the piece, and then you stop and do an introduction that is written by the student or the coaches, and that has to include the titles and the authors. That's what the introduction is. They all need a story arc. I think that's true whether it's humorous or dramatic. There needs to be a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's typical language arts dramatic structure, right? It needs to follow that. There are theoretically time penalties in all of the events. I say theoretically because I think time is the most broken rule in forensics in Kansas because judges can't enforce time unless there's a separate assigned timekeeper. And so, you want to say anything about that, Megan?
Yeah, I was going to say, or the tournament says specifically in their invitation that judges pay time.
Right.
So at nationals, if you do national competition, NCFL, NITOC, and SDA, any of those, you can time, and you can absolutely use time as a penalty. I don't know. I've always thought it was weird that we have a rule that we can't enforce.
But we've surveyed that a bunch, and it just never passes.
Why does that rule exist? It seems like it's just inviting abuse.
Yeah, the rule exists because they don't want judges to be distracted with other things, and they want them focused on the performance. And so I think that most judges, since they're adults, are perfectly capable of hitting start on their phone timer, watching a performance, and then hitting stop when it ends. But there's been a lot of debate about that.
Yeah, there has been a lot of debate about it. And there's a range of the way people think about it too, Joe. I grew up in Oklahoma, and in Oklahoma, judges can time, and if you're 1 second over time, you're disqualified. So I mean, there's like, that's the far other extreme, right? So anyway, I think creativity is important in all of these events. I actually think creativity is important in all 11 events, but I think in terms of the interp and the acting events, it's incredibly important. I think believability, at least in terms of the dramatic things, is really, really important. And then I put this one up because there's a huge difference. Megan's nodding because we've seen this, like, especially, well, I don't think it's more true in dramatic than it is in humor, but the kids that are brave enough to go all out, to really pour into a performance, are the ones that stand out. There was a dramatic interp final at NSDA. It's been a long time ago now. It was in Kansas City. And it was one of those moments where all 6 of the kids on stage, like, they just kept one-upping each other with how into the characters, how fearless they were, how believable. Like, it was one of the best hours I've ever spent watching forensics, and it had to do with them being fearless. So you want to add anything to common elements there, Megan?
Yeah, I would say physicality. And I always tell, like, after I introduce forensics events in my forensics classes, I have 20 children that want to do humorous interpretation because they watch it, they think it's funny, and they don't get how willing you have to be. Yeah, it's really difficult out of all the events. I mean, all of them are difficult to some extent, but humorous interpretation more so, because not only do you have to be willing to look stupid and to do whatever you are physically capable of with your body to sell characters and to visualize the story and to make all of those characters believable. So I think physicality is really important, and the ability to just like let loose with your body and not care what other people think about. And for high schoolers, that's really difficult. So they're so self-conscious of their voices and their bodies. And so for a lot of these events to be believable and to be creative, like Mr. Tidwell is talking about, you have to also have that ability to not care about what you're doing with your body.
Yeah. Yeah. And that breeds into fearlessness at some level, but you're right. The physical control is pretty incredible. My kids, you say your kids do that with HI. My kids all want to do duo. And I talked to them about how duo is, I think, the most physically demanding thing, because you not only have to control your body, but you have to be perfectly in sync with somebody else. So, I guess we'll talk about that in a second. Okay, so humorous and dramatic interp. These are 5 and 6A events. Humorous interp and dramatic interp are exactly what they sound like. It is one person doing a humorous performance, or one that's supposed to be humorous, and one person doing a dramatic performance. And I think it's important to note that humor can have elements of drama in it, that makes the humor work better sometimes. And I think the best DIs always have elements of humor in them. I think that's an incredibly, it's not, it's primarily humorous. It's primarily dramatic, right? You may play more than those kids may play more than one character. I've seen this fluctuate in my time in the activity. HI still tends to be really heavily reliant on lots of characters, kind of ridiculous, extreme characters some of the time. Dramatic, for a long time, dramatic was always just one character. And then in the last few years, I think, Megan, are you seeing this too? What I see in the trend is there's a main character, there's still one primary character, but they hint at other characters now.
I chaired DI this year and got to announce finals of nationals at NSDA, and the young lady that won was a lovely Latina lady, and she did a piece called Responsabilidad about being deported and about her son having special needs, and how hard the impact is for those children when they go into detention centers, and how our country looks down on that. And she interacted with multiple characters. They never spoke, and she never played those characters, but she directly addressed them.
So she was playing to the characters that we couldn't hear.
Yep. Right. And that happened in at least 3 of the finalists from this year at nationals. I
tend to tell my DI kids that if you have a DI that has another character in it, we almost play that, instead of like playing the other character, we almost play that as if you're telling the story and showing us what your interpretation of that, what your character's interpretation of that other character sounds like. In the same way that when we tell a story about something that happens with a kid, we have a voice for the kid that's not really that kid. You know what I mean? Like you sort of allude to that other character. Megan is right. HI tends to be pretty intensely physical. It also tends, I don't have this on the slides, it also tends to really be heavily reliant on sound effects and almost rhythm sometimes to make that function.
Yeah, I say techie. It's more techie.
Yeah, it's more techie. So
you have to use your body to do sound effects, your voice. You'll hear kids beatbox or do to open the door, all the sound effects and stuff. So it's a lot more techie, I would say.
And I think that's true because you can't have props. So techie in HI is sound effects and movements and big things, and techie in DI is what Megan talked about being able to visualize characters that aren't there so that the audience imagines them there, being able to mime and pantomime things, to be able to hold things that aren't there, to see things that we talk a lot with my kids about being able to see the environment you're in, even though the audience can't see it. You have to be in that room. You have to be in that space. So I think they're both techie in different ways. They both have a 10-minute time limit. These are also memorized events. We are going to do, Pam McComas and I are going to, on January 4th, we're going to do a whole session on finding material. And so I don't want to get deeply into that, but I will say this. HI material seems to be pretty much the Wild West. Like you can do about anything as HI material. There's still lots of people doing plays. My best HIs for the last 5 to 7 years have all come, and I'm going to say this, and some other 6A coach is going to watch it and just roll their eyes. Most of my HI material for the last 5 to 7 years has come from Play Scripts Inc. That stuff works for HI, and it works competitively even at the 6A level. But there's also memoirs that are funny, and there's comic strip. Like I've seen kids do comic strips. I cut a duet when I was first learning to cut material years ago from Burt Breatha's Bloom County Billy and the Boingers. Like you can do anything that you can find that exists in print, right? DI when I was in high school, a bazillion years ago, um, we found monologue sections of plays. That was almost entirely what DI was. That hasn't been true in a long time. Memoirs are where most of the DIs come from at this point. Like,
Can I interject there a little
yeah,
bit?
absolutely.
One thing I do is I go to Amazon.com and I look up best biographies for XYZ or newest autobiographies. And then I just go read the backs of them. And the best DIs that we've cut at my school in the last 5 years have all come from me just ordering a bunch of books off of Amazon. And then kids will take them and read them, or I'll read them and then cut them from that material.
I would this runs really fast into the thing that Pam and I will probably do. I will also tell you this: when Megan and I talk about biographies and memoirs, sometimes great DIs come. You can find DIs in fiction things, but when I find a DI in a fiction book, it's almost never the main story. It's like a subplot in a novel.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So
I just have a very quick question. You say you cut them? Like,
we do some. My kids do some of both. My program, we do some of both.
so I can cut and help them write intros and stuff like
oh,
that.
absolutely,
As
absolutely.
they're learning now, because I
So
don't
what
have a
I do, Ida, is I will give them, so like if we're cutting a brand new piece, and normally these are my kids that are coming back, I will have them choose a book, or I've ordered something for them, or we've had something in mind. And then I have them read it and sticky note it. And then just the pages of the main storyline that they think they're following. And then I have them type those up. And then I have them look at areas where the story doesn't make sense, it's incomplete, or we need to chop stuff out. And then after they've done a rough edit, I go look at it. And they give me an estimated time for how long it is. And then I'll look at it and see what I can cut out of it. And then I give it back to them and have them retime it and see if there's any other adjustments they can make. When it comes to like introductions and like orations, informatives, things that are written out, absolutely I edit. There's a long editing process. I have a self-editing checklist that I think I stole from Melissa Lepp. But after they write, I have them self-edit and then peer edit and then I edit. So
now we don't have a class, so we're going to have to help them as much as possible.
absolutely.
Yeah, and Ida, I know that we've talked about this already. For the situation you're in, and I don't know that I recommend this in every situation, but for the situation you're in where you don't have a class, it's a brand new program. I would use the heck out of, and I don't want to be advertising anybody's product here, but I would use the heck out of Forensics Fanatics this year.
I have questions on that I'll save for when we do the material.
Yeah, I also would recommend, Ida Marie, if they can get you some money, the Starlit books and the color interp books from the interp store, those have pieces that are ready, performance ready, that they just need intros written for.
So let's do that. Let's do that at the end, or we won't get done.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. So there are issues with all of those things. I'm just going to tell you there are issues with all of those things. Okay. So any questions about HI and DI specifically?
I would add one more thing that I tell my students. Tragedy is universal. We all pretty much think the same things are sad. And so it's less likely that you offend a judge or off-put a judge, and more people can relate to the story that you're telling. If you do HI, because of the physicality and some of the jokes that you put in, you have to be aware of stereotypes and not playing to those because you don't want to offend people. Mr. Tidwell may think that fart jokes are the funniest thing on earth, and I just may not even laugh at them at all and be turned off by that. So humor is subjective. We each think different things are funny. And so you take a lot more risks in doing a humorous interpretation than you do in doing a dramatic interpretation.
I think that's true. All right, duo interp is obviously two people. Joe, what class are you? 5, okay. And then everybody else here is either 2 or 1, right? Ida, you all are 2, or are you 3?
We are 3A.
Okay, all right. Duo interp actually only exists at 5 and 6A level. it is, I have said for many years, and probably my teams have shown this over the years. I'll see if Megan nods here too, right? Duo Interp is probably my favorite forensics event. And I love it. And I think I'll get into a little bit more as we talk about how it works. Both actors play more than one character in duo. They don't have to, they can. They don't get any props. And this is a big distinction between this and duet acting, which is the other Keisha event. The two actors cannot make physical contact or eye contact with each other while they perform. The exception to that is during the actual written intro. So any part of the performance that comes from the written script, they can't make eye contact with each other or physical contact with each other. And that forces this to be an incredibly technical event.
And you should think about it like taking a scene and folding it in half. So they're not directly interacting, they're looking past, they're not engaging directly.
And when I first tell kids that, they all say, "Oh, that's hard. That's going to look dumb." Like you can hear them murmuring about how weird that looks. And then I show them one. And about 2 minutes in, they don't even notice that these kids are not looking at each other because it's that DI technicality that Megan was talking about for DI. Like you have to see what's there. You have to see what's there like it's there, even though it's not there, right? If you go to shake your partner's hand because there's a handshake in it, that has to be perfectly in sync. This is all about technique. Duo is so tightly wound on technique, and the difference between a good duo and an amazing duo is how flawless that technique is. Like I have to do all of the other interp things that we're talking about, character and fearlessness and big, and they have to do all those other things, and they have to be completely in sync with a partner they're not looking at. And I love this event. I just do. I love it dramatic. I love it funny. I think the best duos tend to be a pretty good mixture of funny and serious, or they have a lot of humor in them, and then they turn and make a pretty important dramatic point in the last 2-3 minutes. And I have taken duos in terms of sources for duos. Obviously, this is a memorized event. I have taken duos from novels. I have taken duos from plays. I have taken duos from literally the Weekly World News collected articles. Yeah, that old magazine rag. We did a duo. Took a duo to nationals that was Bat Boy articles. Not Bat Boy the musical. Like we took the news articles and turned them into a duo. I just think this is a really fun event. But kids gravitate toward this event, at least because we don't have duet acting. Kids gravitate toward this event because they think there's safety with a partner. And so I'll start the season and I'll have 15 freshman duos, and 3 of them or 4 of them will make the end of the season because they just don't understand how hard this work is. Some of my best duos that they should have gotten PE credit for because there was choreography and all kinds of stuff. So any questions about duo before we jump into the acting stuff?
Yeah, and technique's even more important on this. You'll see puppetry, voice dubbing, beatboxing, like anything from like physical flips. Like there has been everything. I will say that this year it was interesting. I got to judge live duo interp finals. I didn't watch the async ones. But the way that they utilized the camera was pretty brilliant in a lot of those duos. And it was interesting because the duos that won and got first, second, and third were all serious, 100%. Pretty heavy.
I think that's pretty normal, Megan, at nationals.
Yeah.
We sent 2. Did we send 2 duos to NSDA nationals last year? I know we did to NITOC. I think we did to NSD. Did we get 2 of the 3?
I think we did. Yeah.
The two that we had in play at the end of the season were really different. One of them was a PlayScripts Inc. thing that was multiple scenes about bad breakups. And the other was literally we did Chicago the musical in 10 minutes. So Megan was talking about puppetry, and that made me think of that because there's a part, there's one song in that show where the lawyer is puppeting.
Will one of you guys at some point, not today, explain NITALK versus NSDA and how do we know what we?
I can do that for you, but that is not a question for tonight.
That's what I was going to say. I didn't mean for tonight.
No, it's a fair question. This is the result of trying to do too many things in the same session already. So, all right, acting events. Okay, so I told Megan that it was hard for me not to think like a 6A coach on this because I live in Terp world. And so I'm going to tell you that everything we just said about Interp world, all of that stuff is true in acting events. They are not the same events. Interp is different than acting. But the easiest way to explain it, at least initially to kids, is in duet, they can make physical contact and they do look at each other. It's like watching two kids on stage. Same thing with the acting, serious solo acting, humorous solo acting. There was a time when it was easier to tell you the difference between DI and SSA and HI and HSA. Because there was a time where in Terp, you were not allowed to move your feet. Kids didn't move. Now they do. And it's become, I think those 4 events are very nebulous in terms of what the differences really are, except that for those of you who have humorous solo and serious solo, your kids can use a chair as a part of that performance. Okay? So the DI and HI kids cannot use a chair. This is also a point where, and it's actually, I'll say the same thing about duet. Duet, they're actually allowed 2 chairs and a table. Now, I will tell you that when...
You cannot stand on the table.
Can't stand on the table, can't lay down on the table. I will tell you that when we were this was still a 6A event until about 4 or 5 years ago. And I love duet because I did duet in high school. That was my main event. I didn't ever let kids use tables, and the reason I didn't let kids use tables was because you never knew what the table you would look like that you were going to get from one tournament to another. Right? Like you'd show up at one tournament and have an 8 by 4 foot fold-up table, and you'd show up at the next tournament and be a 1 student standalone desk. Like the tournament just has to provide a table to those rooms. There's no like definition of what that table looks like. And so I just decided as a coach it was a wild card, and I took it out of the mix.
And
but
I'll
that,
say
that was a decision I made. I'm not saying you should make that decision.
And I'll say that from a 4A perspective, where I spent about 10 years coaching in 4A classification, if you are 4A, 3A, 2A, 1A, the chair is an integral part of the performance.
Yes.
You need to include it in the blocking. You need to use it. I'll also say that as someone who had kids stand on chairs, we brought our own chair with us to state. So if we weren't sure what they were going to give us and we weren't sure the table was going to be sufficient or the chair, we brought one with us.
We did that too. We did the same thing. I will also say that when I was getting to coach duet, particularly, although HI too at some level, but definitely when I was coaching duet, those chairs are the only legal prop. And it didn't have to look like a chair when we were using it. We made mountains and walls and crowns and spaceships. Like the chairs became whatever we could imagine them to become. Is that?
I'm going to get off here, Russ.
I'm sorry, what?
I'm just going to get off here so I can spend time with my family. You said you're recording. Are you sending it to us, or do we?
Yeah, Mike's going to upload it and put it in the in the Astra stuff, and we'll make sure that everybody has access to that.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay. Send me other questions by email, Ida.
I will.
Okay. All right. Okay. So I guess the question is, does anybody have any? These are 10 minutes too. Same time limits. And I should talk about cross qualification. So I live in Garden City. There's only one other 6A school close to me, and close means 50 miles, Dodge City. The next 5A school is Hayes. That's 110 miles away. So we compete in a lot of 4-3-2-1A tournaments. Certainly my younger kids do. And so a lot of those tournaments, well, all of those tournaments, they don't host DI or HI or duo. So because of that, and because some of you may live in areas where you go to like an Olathe tournament or a Wichita tournament or whatever, and they host DI, HI, and duo, they don't host those other things. If the tournament only hosts HI or only hosts HSA, and your student qualifies for state in that event, which you do by placing first or second and lower depending on how many kids are in the event. So let's say that Joe goes to a tournament and they only have HSA. His kid wins HSA. His event at state is HI. Everybody following what I'm trying to explain here? That kid gets to do HI at 5A state. The qualifying in an HSA only tournament gets that kid qualified in HI. That's true in HI, HSA, DI, SSA, duo, duet, and it's currently true, although I think we're going to see a movement to change this. It's currently true in informative and informative 10. There are some things that are more problematic with those two events than these other events, I think. So, any questions about these events? Either of you? Have you both seen these events somewhere along the way?
I mean, 30 years ago when I was in high school, yeah.
Okay, fair enough. Monica, did you compete in these things?
Yes, I did. I
Perfect.
participated in forensics in high school. So
Perfect.
I remember some things just hearing
Okay.
you talk about them.
All right. So does anybody have questions about these events? Anything that you want to know or something I didn't explain, or Megan, you want to throw anything in about acting versus interp? I think that here's what I think. I think that duo and duet are very different. But I also think that duets really benefit from stealing some technique from duo. It's other than the chair, which, as Megan said, needs to be an integral part of what you do in 4A for sure, 321A. I think it's harder now to tell the difference between those events than it used to be. My kids don't have trouble going into an HSA tournament and being competitive without a chair. We will occasionally get dinged because we didn't use a chair in SSA. But I think the flip side of that is the kids that go to a DI tournament and are used to using their chair, they have to make that adjustment too. So I don't know. I think that the cross qualification rule is going to exist as long as I'm coaching. I don't see that going away anytime soon. So
the one thing I would add is Mr. Tidwell talked about state qualification. There are 2 state tournaments. One is a championship. That's where you're allowed as a school to qualify 16 events. And those 16 events can come in any of the events that are eligible for your classification. And then you take your 16 entries and you go, and that's where they have semifinals, finals, and you get a state champion. So when Mr. Tidwell is talking about qualifying for state, he's talking in terms of state championship and in terms of placing first or second, or maybe third or fourth if it's a really big tournament. There is a state festival that's really similar to band or choir festival. Students qualify for that. It's much more generous in how they qualify. So a lot more students get to qualify at tournaments. You also can attend a regional festival to qualify. That they show up on a day, you have a scheduled time to perform your event. You perform once for a judge. If you get a 1 rating, you get a medal and a certificate. If you get a 2, 3, or 4, you just get a certificate, and then your day is done. I know that some schools just do festival, some schools just do champs. I do champs and festival just because I tend to have so many kids qualify for state, and because champs is at my school and festivals at Kansas Wesleyan, so it's in the same region for me. But there are festivals, one in Kansas City, one in Wichita, and one in Salina. So that's just something to keep in mind too.
Yeah, we do both things too. I do it for the same reason Megan does. Whoever doesn't make my top 16, they have the choice to go to festival. Mike, you're hosting that went with you to Southeast, right? You're hosting the Wichita Area State Festival.
Yes, I am.
And 3A champ.
Correct.
Okay. All right.
I got one quick question. You mentioned it, and maybe I can find this answer in the rules, but I'll ask you here. The anchoring your feet, people in turf events don't have to be sunk into the concrete anymore.
Nope. When you and I were in high school, they did.
Is it like lateral movement then?
No, they can move. They
can use pretty much all the space. I
all.
used to teach my kids like a 3 foot by 3 foot box for inter. I don't teach that anymore. So they can pretty much use whatever space is available to them. Little bit different discussion in prose and poetry as soon as we get to those black book events.
So, but they still are, they don't face each other. They're still facing the judge.
You'll
in
Joe,
duet?
I would recommend to watch some. You're an NSBA member, are you?
Yeah.
I would log in and watch. 2019 was the last year it was live, I think.
Okay.
Just watch a couple, because where it used to be a scene that's completely cut in half, it's still that way, but I would say it's more angled in towards each other, and they look past each other now.
That's Megan's right. Like, we've been through phases in duo as that event has adjusted and adapted and whatever. It used to be exactly what she said. These two kids acted like this, and they looked at the judge. Now they kind of act in. She's right. They tend to act into each other and look past each other. But then there'll be moments where they're not doing that. It's pretty nebulous at this point. What's important is that what they do is consistent and like you learn to believe it. And that makes it incredibly technical. I think that's in terms of duo.
Yeah, I would say this year's duo final round was really good, but it looks different because they're interacting with the camera, because it was via Zoom. And so they have a lot of blocking and stuff that we can't do when we're in person. So
now the flip side of that was we did learn to use the camera. And so like we learned to, like you can't live, you can't just like and hop back, and so there was we did some of that, and I saw a lot more of it in the national tournament, even than we were playing with. So the video part of it makes that different. And I'm at a point where I'm pretty willing to say that if I were a betting man, I bet we get to do it on video again this year. But I just think the survey that we got looks. But anyway, I digress. That's not part of this conversation. So. All right, let's talk about what Megan called black book events. I call book events. Black book is pretty descriptive. These are events where students have the script in their hand. By rule, they have to have the script in their hands. The rule does not require them to have it in a black book, but they will all have it in a black book. And
I would say that's pretty standardized. You'll go to a couple smaller school tournaments where they just have a giant binder,
right.
But most people will use a 5.5 by 8.5 inch black book. That's
I'm looking around my office to see if I have one in here.
I don't have any at home. I think there might be one downstairs by Tia's room, but yeah. So it's a 5.5 by 8.5, 1 inch, 3-ring binder.
And I think almost all of us buy them from the Black Book Depot.
I buy them off of Amazon.
Is that size a required size, or is that just the conventional size? That's
It's
what I
a
like to it.
conventional size, and it's the easiest size for a kid to handle and actually do a performance.
And to use it like because a lot of people will use the binder as if it were a prop or an extension of their body, especially in POI.
Yeah. Which means we're going to get to the second most broken rule in a minute, and third. in forensics, and they're both in prose and poetry. Okay, so prose is, we could have a whole night where people who cared would argue about what prose is and what poetry is. Actually, the argument is always about what poetry is. And I'm going to say it like this. Prose tends to be things that are written as traditional stories, and it tends to be written in traditional paragraphs. Okay? Now, that being said, there are poets who write like that, and they call their stuff poetry. I don't want to get into the argument about what is poetry and what is not. I will simply say this. My guideline has always been, what does the author intend it to be? That's when my kids bring me something and say, is this prose or is this poetry? My question is not, what does the Library of Congress say? Is not, what does the publisher say? Is not, what did Dr. Seuss think his stuff was? Which, by the way, is an annual argument. What did the author think it was? And so that's the way I tend to make that distinction. There will, you will almost definitely, if you do this very long, encounter a protest at a tournament because one fish, red fish, two blue fish, purple fish, whatever that is being done in prose and it's being done in poetry at the same tournament. And somebody thinks it's one, and those are all just, I don't know. Anyway, prose tends to be written as a story, tends to be written in paragraphs. We take a lot of prose from novels or short stories. I used to take lots of prose from short stories. Increasingly over the last 10 years or so, I cut a lot of prose, or I point my kids to cut a lot of prose from pretty well established blog sites. And I don't mean like anybody can log in and blog. I mean, this personality has a blog site. Does that make sense? The one that will be on the recording that somebody will complain about is that we've done, Anna Lynn Thomas writes stuff, and her site is literally called Ha-Has for Hoo-Has. And she writes from a very traditional feminine perspective about, and she just tells funny stories about her life. And we found that things like that tend to work pretty well for prose. You can find novels that are written like that too. Jenny Lawson has written a couple of things. Furiously Happy is an example. I can't remember the name of her other book, but both of her books they're like chapters in each chapter. What's that?
Let's pretend this never happened.
Let's pretend this never happened.
She also has a fantastic blog, called The Blog S. That's where she started. So, and they're like just those kinds of collections of. There's a book called Not That Kind of Girl. That's just a collection of stories. It's not really a whole story. It's sort of collections of stories. And so those are kinds of places I tend to get prose. I don't know what Megan does for poetry, but I predict that we're not far off of each other based on what I see her kids do at tournaments and what my kids do at tournaments. 6A, I haven't been doing any of this. Prose and poetry or book events, they're 7 minutes maximum. Somebody make me talk about memorization in a minute. We've been talking about, I think that both prose and poetry need to tell stories. Now here's where things change a little bit. In poetry, Joe, this is important for you. I don't know the level at which this is important in 1, 2, 3A, although if you're at a tournament, Monica, where your kids have to compete against 5 and 6A kids, this becomes important. Poetry is almost universally done as programs now. And so what I mean by that is, Joe, if I'm doing the math right on your thing, when you were in high school, we were still finding one long poem and doing a long poem, right?
I cobbled together a couple of them the year I tried.
Yeah, I say that. I did like a collection of Shel Silverstein poems, but they had to all be from the same author.
Right.
and you did one poem and then another poem and then another poem.
Yeah, I think they were thematic. It was allowed to be
Yeah, it could be
thematic, not the
thematic or
same.
by author. Now, here's
Yeah.
what a poetry program
Russ,
now
what you
doesn't
just
sound like.
described right there, my 4A down people from my years in 4A, that's what you will still see as programs in 4, 3,
Okay,
2, 1A.
so they're still doing multiple poems, but they do
Yeah,
one poem.
some
and
of them will
another.
do programs like Mr. Tidwell is going to describe them, but most of them will be, I've picked a theme or I have an author and I'm reading poems back to back.
About that, back to back, and you build that up. Like, you still need a traditional story arc, right? Like, you still need a climax at the end of that performance and falling action. That's not the way we do that in 5 and 6. It hasn't been for years. If I have a kid who wants to do poetry, they don't already have a poem that they're interested in, and I say because that's the way they come to me. I have one poem. I will say to a student who wants to do poetry, here's how you find poetry. I want you to go to Google, and I want you to type in spoken word poetry about and put your theme in, and then start reading poems. It has to be written. You can't watch YouTube videos and transcribe them. You have to find it in writing. If you can find it in writing, you find as many poems as you want about that, but you find one poem that is your central, that is the one you love, and then find some other poems that are about that same thing. And then what we do is we take that main poem, and we start with the beginning of it, and we find the end of it. We find the biggest moment in it, and then we take another poem that the kid likes, and so you do a little bit of the first poem, and then a little bit of the second poem, and a little bit of a third poem, and then you come back to the first poem, and you just interlace these things to tell the overall program story that you want to tell about that theme that you've picked out. Now, I will tell you that I don't know if this is, I call this debate brain. My debate brain loves that. I love taking the pieces and putting them together to tell a story. It's one of the reasons I like Poi so much, I think. There's another reason,
And I'll tell you that the cutting can be so creative that you only use a few words from one to intersperse, or if one has like a rhythmic pattern.
Yep.
You can use that as a common rhythmic theme
Yep.
throughout. Since one thing I always say is that poetry should have some form of rhythm and meter, even if it's free verse. There needs to be some kind of pattern that distinguishes what the poems are and how you.
And you can create that vocally.
Mhm.
Even if it doesn't feel like I find that when we start cutting, like, I'll let the kids cut the thing together to begin with, and then I'll go back and edit their cutting and rearrange stuff, and we'll talk about rhythm and pacing and story arc and some of the best times I have with kids in forensics is building either a poetry program or a POI program. One of the things that's important, I think, about, I would also say this: poetry has become at least in 5 and 6A, I think poetry has become an activist event. Is that fair, Megan?
Absolutely. People are making an argument in literature.
People are making an argument. They're picking poems because they have something they want to say that is important to be said about some social ill or some
yeah, and almost all of them have to do with social justice issues of some
social
sort.
justice, or even like personal, like things that we think that we should have a society do better, which I guess is social justice, but
A value.
And I think that that's still really true.
One thing I would say that's a valuable source for poetry, I would subscribe to Button Poetry
Button
and their
Poetry.
website. And then I would look for their sales when they sell books, because they have taken a bunch of spoken word poets
Yes.
who are very famous in their own rights on the internet and in forensic circles. And they have given those poets a way to cheaply publish their works. And they have big sales where you can get discounted books. And so I have almost every book Button Poetry has ever published.
I agree. Well, and I'd also say this is, I'm sure that we'll talk about this when Pam and I do material, finding and selecting material. I'm not afraid to email a poet. So you have a kid who finds something on YouTube that they just love. We just love. I just love it, but I can't find it written, and I go to looking and I can't find it. More than one time, I or the kid have emailed a poet and said, "Do you know if this is written anywhere on the internet, published? Is it written and not just performed?" And about half the time, I think it's about half the time, the poet will email us back and say, "Yeah, here you go," and give us a link.
So that's a question. What are the rules of publish and available? Like, is it
tag Megan?
So for Keisha, the rules are really loosey-goosey. It's you have to have a URL that works and takes you to a written version of the poem. So a lot of the times, like my kids will find spoken word poems that have just been republished on a lyrics website or published on someone's blog, or like a copy of it has been transcribed. For state, that counts. So state, you have to be able to produce either the original copy, a book, or just have a URL link that works.
But I think that the NSDA rules are now kind of that.
They are kind of that now. So, and I haven't read them closely enough. They used to have, NSDA used to have an approved website list, and you had to, but you could get anything on that list anyway.
Good.
But now anything, as long as you can prove that it's published and there is a clear author, I believe, and a text format, you can use whatever.
I think that's true. Those rules got really, really less restrictive at the end of last year for NSDA. CASHA rules have always been really loose. So since the internet became popular, it's literally, if you have a functional link to a printed version of it, you can do it. Or a printed version, either way. I guess the last thing I'll say about prose and poetry is, okay, two things. One, Megan alluded to people use the book as a prop. I'm telling you, my kids are going to use that book like a prop, like it's their job. We're going to find ways to use it as a prop. Now that's a very 6A thing. We go to a school out here that's a smaller school, and we do that. We will sometimes get grieved because the rule is ambiguous. What the rule says, one place the rule says you can't use any props, and in another place it says the book must be an integral part of the script must be an integral part of the performance. Because we're 6A, because I know what that event looks like at state, prose and poetry, those events, we're going to be willing to take the risk of using that as a prop. If you're in 4321A, you probably can't take as much risk there. I think that's the third most broken rule in the forensics manual. if you're breaking rule, and I don't think you're breaking rule. I think integral part means that you're not.
Yeah, and the other thing, Mr. Tidwell has the no feet movement up here. The rules do say small movement on transition.
Yeah, the rules. So that's the second most broken rule in forensics. The manual says that in prose and poetry, the performer cannot move their feet except for one small step at transition. Is actually what the wording says.
It's not even a broken rule. Grievances don't even get upheld anymore for that rule. People
they
try
do
to.
They do in 4321A, Mike.
Yes, they do.
Okay.
They don't in our world. They don't in our world. They do in 4321A.
I got grieved 4 weekends in a row by a 4A coach at different tournaments one year for that rule, and I won every one of those grievances because the rule book very clearly says you can use a small step for transitions, and transitions mean a lot of different things.
Right.
I think transitions.
When we get to poi in a minute, I think that my argument is going to be that poi is going to be the reason that the movement rule and the book rule go away in prose and poetry eventually. I got to get through this fast because I said this was going to be an hour, and we're an hour in, and we haven't gotten to any of Megan's events yet. So facial expression and gestures are incredibly important. And then there's a whole section of things that I wanted at some point, we're going to have to do a whole session on book tech. And I don't even mean using the book as a prop. I mean the way you hold the book, the way you open and close the book. Like there's like a system to that, and it's one of those like unwritten conventions that almost gets enforced as rules by judges. And so like I mean it's up to and including like the way you hold your book while you are taking control of the room, the way that you open your book to start, the way you close your book and hold it to do your introduction, like presenting the book, pulling it in, like that, all that stuff. And we're going to have to do a whole section on that, I think, at some point.
You call it book tech, we call it book work, and we talk about floppy book syndrome and a bunch
Floppy
of
book syndrome.
things.
Hold that book in a hard V, don't. I mean, yeah, it's and it's the different. You can have a kid who's an amazing performer with sloppy book work, and in a final they'll get third or fourth. That's not an overstatement, is it, Megan?
No.
Okay. All right. So let's talk about POI. I'm going to try to do this more quickly like this. It's a book event. It is a 10-minute event. This is a 3A. This is such a bizarre thing. This is 3A and 5 and 6A. 4A doesn't have it. 1A and 2A don't have it. It is an NSDA and CFL event. And it is the best. Mike and I were talking about this a week or two ago. This is the best. This event is, this is my new favorite forensics event. I know it's Megan's favorite forensics event. And I think the reason that it's a lot of our favorite forensics events is because it's the most amazing mixture of debate and interp that exists. It's memorized. Here's what makes it cool. You have to take and build your program from multiple sources, but specifically, you have to use different genres of literature. So if the genres of literature are prose, poetry, and drama, you have to use at least 2. Most kids use all three. You'll see poise that have 3 or 4.
Yeah, we also use technical writing quite a bit.
Yeah, well, I see, that's a good idea. Well, and I don't know what you mean exactly by technical writing. We use news a lot in ours. And so what makes it great is that you have to make an argument. There's got to be a socially conscious argument about this. The very first POI any of my kids ever did was a brand new event immediately after Stoneman Douglas happened, that shooting. And one of the first POIs we did was about school shootings. We called it Enough is Enough. Megan had a kid doing one about the same thing that year. We used really different sources, but our argument was, when are we going to do something about this? When is enough enough? Our program that year was, we started with the phone call, the 911 phone call from the Columbine Library, did the intro. Then we did a little bit of a poem. We had a poem that was about a victim, that was from a victim perspective. We did another. So what we did was we built it so that every 2 or 3, every minute or so, there was another 911 call from another shooting. And we finished it with the student speech at that memorial or protest after Stoneman Douglas. Megan's kids included some of those same sources because they were just incredibly powerful. But what I love about this event is you get to let the kid say, this matters to me. We need to talk about this. We've got to say, one of the best ones I've seen in a national final, it's hard to show freshmen. Like, I don't show it to freshmen, but it's so good. There's one called Debate Like a Girl. And that was the first time that I watched it, and I realized that just like in poetry, Megan was talking about like I said, find your central piece, and she was talking about like using that to create rhythm. Find an anchor piece and build your program around that anchor piece. Her anchor piece in that performance was a poem that was not about debate.
It was Drum Dream Girl.
Drum Dream Girl. And she used that for rhythm, and she used it as an anchor to keep bringing things back together for the metaphor. Harris and I talked about this last week. he likes this event for the same reason. Like those of us who think about debate arguments, it's a 1AC, but it's a performative 1AC. It's poetry and drama, and it's an amazing it's an amazing event because it lets kids, it's not just activists, it lets them have a voice about something that matters to them in a way that they feel like they get the opportunity to talk to adults who have to listen to them say, we've got to make a change.
I tell the kids, I've been working on Play with the kids a little bit, and I've been teaching them it as though it's like music. And I like to use Kanye West and Dr. Dre as examples because it's like taking a sample or an interpolation of an old song. So for like Kanye, it's like taking an old Otis Redding song around a theme. And then each of the verses is a story, and you're building a story. And in Poi, you're just taking other people's words to create that story around this central theme, this chorus that keeps coming back, that anchor piece, that sample that keeps coming in, is that constant thing that brings you back the whole time.
Which, by the way, Dr. Dre, Kanye, and some of those things would be pretty good anchor pieces if you pick the right things.
Well, so for the Dr. Dre one, the example that we gave was one off of his original album, and it was about the riots in South Central Los Angeles. And so for the anchor piece, he had the news commentary, and he had a sample of a reporter reporting about what's going on the streets that day. He had an old Jamaican reggae song, and then it was the story from the perspective of being a young man in South Central, and it's just a cool way that they put that together that kids can relate to really easily if you've got kids that like that kind of music.
I think the last thing I need, there's so much we're going to do a whole session on Poi at some point. One of the things that is different between this and prose and poetry is that there is no movement restriction.
Except the book has to remain in the performer's
Except that the book has to remain in the performer's hand. Yes, that's absolutely a rule.
That's rule number 3 that's been broken sometimes.
Yeah, no, it gets broken a lot, but I can tell you that at least at one NSDA tournament, 2 kids got DQ'd in finals for it. So that has been an enforced rule. So anyway, so questions about Poi. I get pretty excited talking about Poi because I love it.
Yeah, it's hands down my favorite event. And when I teach it to kids, it's an argument in literature form.
Yeah.
You find something that you're passionate about. It's work though. Like it's a hard event to put together and to do it right. But when it's done right,
it's fun,
man,
though. It's fun.
Yeah.
And it is like a 1AC in that something like we find that our kids who really take it seriously, that performance changes across the season as we modify and adjust and find better pieces. All right, so we've been in an hour. We said we were going to go an hour and a half. We're not going to make an hour and a half if we do all this tonight. So are you two good hanging in? Because we can reschedule and do the other half of this a different night. Although I promised Megan she was doing this tonight. So, all right, I'm going to turn it over to her. She's in charge now. She's got prepared speaking events and limited prep events.
Yeah. So these prepared speaking events are what I call platform events because you have a platform to speak from. They're memorized and you write them ahead of time. They're the original work of the students. And they can work on pretty much any topic, although there are some indicators for what topics do well, depending on what classification you're in. So oration, original oration, is in all classifications, 1A through 6A, and it looks the same. Informative has 2 flavors. So there's Info 10, which only 5A and 6A have. And then there's Info 7, which 1A through 4A have. And Mr. Tidwell, I'm gonna have you move the slides for me. I hope he didn't run away already. He probably did. I wonder if I can unshare his screen. Nope. So I guess we'll just kind of talk, and then when he comes, we can see if he can move the slide for us. He ran away to take a break. So oration, I would have said, was one of my favorite events as well. But one thing I always like to do is talk about all the events as though they're my favorite, because I don't want to sell events to a student that it wouldn't be good for them, because I think the good thing about forensics is there's something that every student can be successful at. So oration typically is a 10-minute maximum speech. You want to shoot for about 8 minutes on the minimum side. It's original research that the student writes. It's typically value-based, especially in the 5A and 6A world. So it's more of a value persuasive as opposed to a policy persuasive. So we're talking about changing how someone feels or thinks or how they act on an issue of social importance. What's something that's valuable in our society that needs to be addressed. In 4A, 3A, 2A, and 1A, sometimes you might see some policy-based persuasives where they're talking about a law that needs to be implemented or something that needs to be changed. And typically the final round in 4A would be about half policy-based and half value-based. There's Mr. Tidwell, and he moved the slides for us. So that's one difference between the 5A and 6A classifications. I can't remember the last time I heard a policy-based oration in 5A. So it would have been a long time ago if it had happened. There is a limit to the amount of directly quoted words that a student can use. Although it doesn't directly say this, I believe in the state rules, it does say this in the NSDA rules, and it's just kind of a good rule of thumb. So any direct quotes that they take from a source need to be 150 quoted words or less. They do have to cite their sources and do verbal citations where they give us some expert credentials or qualifications to add some ethos or credibility to their presentation. So they're very unique. I've had a lot of students that love this event. They spend a lot of time editing it, and we adjust the argument throughout the season based off of feedback that we get from judges as we go throughout the season, because we want to have a fine balance of highlighting something value in society that we think is important for us to discuss and important for us to take some kind of action on. But at the same time, we don't want to offend or offset anyone. I do think that the 2019 final round, Harris Husseini, who won, did a brilliant job. His was called Simply Put, I believe, and it did a good job of balancing more conservative ideals and more liberal ideals and talking about how we oversimplify concepts in society and why that's harmful to issues and people. And it's a really well done speech if you want to see a good structure. I will say that oration all has a formula and the formula is very specific. It's written in the same way. There's typically a thematic driver that you use as your attention getting device at the beginning. And that's often used as transition material. It's also a trend for orations to have a personal connection for the student. So they'll have some story that they share about how they directly related to the topic and how that connected to them. And I mean, I know we'll probably do a more in detailed conversation about this, but it all is very formulaic and just highlighting that argument and that value.
Yeah, James Harris is I think we've got James on board to do oration. Yeah, Megan's right about the quoted words. I'm looking it up in the manual now. I should tell you all that this PowerPoint was originally built for my classroom for my kids. And so like I use NSDA rules because they're usually more strict than CASIA. So that's one I missed and I apologize.
When you say identifying the sources, can that be just Professor Hagaman says this, or does it have to be Hagaman in the New York Times and whatever?
Yeah, there's no like specific qualification. You'll see some people say Dr. Joe Brown and his novel Uncovering the Myths of blah, blah, blah explains. So they will add some credentials in order to give qualification to back up what they're saying most of the time. But it can just be as simple as a New York Times article on September 27th said. So it's not always super specific, but most of the time they give some kind of clarification on credentials. Other questions about oration? Throughout the year, one thing I would say is I used to keep an Evernote account, which is just an article clipping app. And when I would see topics that I think would be good topics for oration, I would just clip those articles. And then I keep a list that's a giant document and I just update it. And so it has like topics that I thought were good in 2020 and 2021, and I'll have a list for 2022. And then I also will save the articles on that list and document. And then I give kids that document as a starting point for them to go read some of the articles and see if any of them inspire them. Okay, should we go on to info?
Sure.
We'll see if we can get through these kind of quick. Informative 10 is also my favorite event. So we do informative parties actually at my school, where we do visual aid making parties because we can make them ourselves for a lot cheaper. So this is also 10 minutes long. It's memorized. It is on a topic that has some social significance. So whereas Info 7's a little bit different, Info 7 might take the topic bananas, and you might hear someone sing the Chiquita banana song and talk about varieties of bananas and fun facts about bananas. That's more Info 7-y. Info 10 is typically going to have like a societal implication for like our consumption of bananas, about how their biodiversity is being killed off and we're at risk at losing banana crops, and that is food crop for a significant portion of individuals in Latin America. So it would have more of a social significance to the end. It's original, it's student written. They will also memorize it and cite their sources and identify them. But typically they're going to have like a background point, and then maybe like a timeline. So they're either going to be organized topically by topics, or a timeline of how we've gotten here. But then the third main point is typically the implications for society as a result of this topic and why it's significant. So I gave the banana one as an example because I had someone do one on bananas who was in state finals last year. So
Sorry about that.
You're good. I was like, wait a minute, what happened? So he gave those socially conscious implications, and we've taken topics all over the place. I had someone do one on pandemics a couple of years ago before COVID started. I had someone do one on masks last year, and we talked about the history of masks and now like the societal implications and the debates over protection versus freedom as kind of an implication. So the topics can really be anything. And I listen to a lot of podcasts, and that's where I get a lot of my topics from. I also just read a lot and read a lot of blogs and read a lot of websites. And I do the same thing for Info 10 that I do for oration. I just save articles as I read something. And I think, man, that has a good social significance to it. I know a couple of my better info kids that are back this year. We picked their topics and have started tweaking some of their research and working on organizing some stuff this week. And I'm excited for what those topics are because we found some really good societal implications for some topics that people might not have considered to be socially significant. One thing that makes this.
No, I was going to say, if you want an example of one of these to show to your kids, the one I love to show to kids, and Megan will have others, I'm sure. I don't remember the name of it. You probably do. There's one from like the first or second year. It was a national event, and the topic was, the premise of the informative was about African American hair.
Black hair, yeah.
And it's really well done. The visual aids are really well done. The social consciousness part of it is really well done. Do you remember the name of that speech?
Yeah, it's called The Birds and the Weaves.
That's right.
Yeah. So yeah, that was the second year oration existed. The first year, there's a pretty good speech on helium, and the one that won nationals that year was on augmented humanity. And I love that speech. It's really good. She does a fantastic job. She won nationals the first year. And then Jordan is her name, the young lady that won nationals the second year in 2016. She also won again in 2019 or 2018 with a speech on marijuana and the DARE program. And so it's definitely formulaic, just like oration is. One thing that makes this event one of my favorites is that you also get visual aids. The visual aids are very standardized. People use blackboards the same way they do in college. Those are your primary visual aids. Those will have parts that are Velcroed, or they spin or they tear off. You can cut the blackboards in shapes. The young lady that does the African-American hair speech has it cut out like an afro around the outside of the board. So there are a lot of creative things you can do with that. They also will often have secondary visual aids that are tangible objects. You cannot wear the objects, you can't put them on, you can't take them off, that is a rule. They also can't be audio visual aids. You can't like need electricity or plug them in or have sound. So there are some limitations.
Live animals, you can't have anything alive.
Yeah, no live animals. So there are some limitations on that, but really,
Super interactive. The visual aids are super like very like what's the tactile.
Yeah, we are constantly like Velcroing things on. We have like a tray that we put on the back of our visual aid. We're pulling stuff, putting them on, interacting. I had a young man do one on spice a couple of years ago, where we like listed things on the Scoville scale and talked about the implications and put things on, pulled things off. He actually ate a really hot pepper at the end of his speech and then finished his speech because he could handle whatever peppers that he could eat. So we had a lot of interactive things like that we've incorporated. So our mask speech had actual masks from Japan and from China that were used for different social ceremonies that we took and we hung on to the visual aids and then removed them and then displayed them. And so we had a lot of different things that we have incorporated, but we have visual aid making parties because if you get these professionally done, which some schools do, it'll cost you $300 to $500 a kid. So
yeah, we're actually, one of my assistant coaches had a big vinyl cutter and we used the heck out of that until he moved back to Michigan. I'm now on the hunt for a vinyl cutter that's bigger than like a Cricut because it made it a lot easier in some ways.
Oh yeah. Spray adhesive is your friend. Talk to your art department. My art department has a spray hood. They'll let us use it so that we can go down and put stuff together. They've been
Magnets,
very cool.
wires, Velcro, you name it, hooks.
Yep. So we've done pretty much everything. It's a lot. So, but it's one of our favorites. Any questions about that before we go on to Info 7? Okay, Info 7 is the counterpart to Info 10. It's what Info 10 used to be before most of the big schools have reverted to doing Info 10 because it's a national style type of speech. Info 7 has no visual aids.
It's also worth noting this is 4321A, so it's most of the state, right?
Yep. So it's 7 minutes long. It's a little bit shorter. Some people like that because they think it gives people who struggle with memorization a little bit easier time putting together a speech. These are also originally researched. They're student written. They're memorized. You also quote your sources just like you would at any other time. I would say that these are a lot more interpy than Info 10. They use a lot more puns. So I've seen them on anything. So like hot dogs, bubble gum, dating websites. And we told the most horrible pickup line jokes as transitions in that speech. So like anything you can think of. Oh, I had one on man caves one year. I was just trying to think of some of the ones off the top of my hand.
When we did this event, my quest was always to find something that you think about every day that you don't think about. And that became the speech.
Yeah, we had one on ice where the kids started off wrapping vanilla ice and then talked about the development of ice and how it's used and integrated in society. They're a lot less heavy than the Info 10 because a lot of Info 10 might have some of the puns, might have some of the humor incorporated in it, but definitely have a heavier, more serious implication at the end. These are a little bit more lighthearted. I know that there's one school who I won't name who does acronyms sometimes for their main points of their speech, and they're very neat, kind of how they organize it and do that organizational pattern. So you can play with this one a little bit more. And can be a little bit more lighthearted and not quite as serious. It's a fun event though. I've always had kids do well in Info 7 too.
Yeah.
It is unfair, I think, in some extent. Like if you go to a tournament and they have to collapse the divisions for the Info 7 kids to have to compete with the Info 10 kids. Because not having those visual aids is hard. The converse isn't true though, because my kids will go to tournaments where it's just Info 7. We'll cut the third point to our speech and then we can just give the speech without the visual aids.
I would say too that unless it's changed, and maybe Megan knows better than I do, when Kansas was all doing Info 7, if you're involved in NSDA, a 5-minute version of these speeches tends to be super successful as an expository supplemental event.
Yep.
At NSDA Nationals.
Yep. So, and prior to Info 10 existing at NSDA, we would just take our Info 7s and cut a point off of them and do them at Nationals. Yep. And we had Kansas kids in finals all the time. We've had several Kansas kids make semifinals and late rounds in Info. We did have a Kansas kid get second a couple of years ago. But
I had a kid, I had the same kid third one year and second the next.
Yep. Yep. So definitely something Kansas kids do well doing this at Nationals, because National style for expository is the lighthearted, punny, take an object or concept or thing that we might use every day, like Mr. Tidwell said, that we don't always think about, that maybe has a deeper history. So really any topic will work for an Info 7, whereas for an Info 10, you do have to have that societal implication, the more heavy, almost persuasive sounding third point that makes a little bit of an argument. Questions about Info 7? We'll move on to limited prep, which I know is a lot. And I'm going to try not to spend a lot of time, especially on extemp, even though it's my
I mean, there's three there. There's 3 items there, but you can talk about extemp as one thing mostly.
Yeah. So if you're in classifications 1A through 4A, you only have one flavor of extemp. It's just called extemporaneous speaking. However, you do have students that can choose questions from either the foreign or the domestic packet. So when they're at state or they're at local tournaments, they'll have 2 packets of questions, and they can pick US extemp questions round 1, international extemp questions round 2. There's no regulation on tournaments where it's just extemp. In 5A and 6A, we do get both flavors individually. So there's United States extemp and international extemp. Impromptu speaking, I believe now exists at all classifications, right, Mr. Tidwell? I'm thinking. And then IDA, which is its own special kind of crazy event, exists in 1A through 4A classifications. And there's definitely some schools that do a fantastic job of doing IDAs and putting those together.
Monica, did you do IDA?
I never did, because I actually neber had a partner that I could work with. So
Joe, you look like an IDA guy.
I actually, the Webster tournament in college does a collegiate version of IDA called Duo Improvisational Pairs, otherwise known as DIP. And I did that in college.
Yep.
So
my forensics coach told me that I could not act and should not do it, and I am not funny and should not do it, which I accepted. That's true.
So we'll go ahead and talk about these really quick and then kind of get to the end so we can have some questions. So extemp is my favorite event. It's political. Not every kid is going to be good at extemp. If kids like to read the news, if they're kind of into current events, then that is a topic that's going to be good for them. You go into a draw room. It's typically the library at a school, and you'll have an international or United States extemp packet. You have a draw time. You do have to go to the draw room at your draw time and pick 3 questions. Most of the time, those questions, at least in Kansas, are going to be yes or no questions. So it's going to be, is Russia a democracy? What can the Biden administration, or will the Biden administration be able to pass Build Back Better? And your goal then is to choose a side, yes or no, on those questions, and then to develop a speech that has 3 arguments or 2 arguments as to why the question should be answered the way that you chose. And it kind of supports that. It's really good for debaters. It's an event that I require all my debaters to try. One thing that used to be true of extemp that isn't as true as anymore, if the tournament has internet access, students can just Google. So they don't have to necessarily have a special file. Back in the day, we used to like print news articles off, highlight them, file them in giant tubs and carry those tubs to tournaments. That has evolved to people either using Evernote or Dropbox to create their own nested files. And then that evolved to a couple programs existing, Prepped and Extemp Genie and Extemp. Oh my gosh, I forgot the third one, but Extemp Engine. So those programs exist. 2 of those you can pay for, and they will have a little Google Chrome extension that kids can open and log into their account, and then it downloads files from approved sources. And then debaters in theory and extempers in theory should be reading those articles, highlighting them, and then organizing them into team files on those devices. I think this might be the first year that I don't purchase one of those items. So
Yeah, I'm not going to buy it this year. I'm in the same boat.
Yeah, I just think with all of the tournaments pretty much that we go to, there is Wi-Fi accessibility. And in order to make sure that kids are still reading stuff, I just do weekly news quizzes. So I make like a 10-question quiz about international events and a 10-question quiz about US ongoings. And then I give them that quiz to make sure that they've read. So I will say that I don't ever tell kids that a note card to deliver their speech from is allowed. That is technically a KSHA rule. So if you are in 4A, 3A, 2A, 1A, at some smaller tournaments, card, they've outlined their speech, maybe written their source citations down, and they use that to deliver. I don't tell my children that that exists, because in the 5A, 6A world, you will not make finals if you have a note card. You won't make semifinals if you have a note card. Also, when you try to go to qualify for nationals, no notes are allowed. So that's just not a thing in my world. So I don't even tell my students that's an option. And occasionally I get a student that's mad at me that goes to a small tournament and they're like, Ms. Hagaman, everybody was using note cards there. You didn't tell us that was a thing. So, and I know that if you want to know more details about Extemp, you can watch the Zoom that I have previously done on this topic. So I don't want to talk about it a lot, but there is a specific format for how you organize your points and how you do your introduction. Good Extemp speeches will have about 4 to 7 sources. Great Extemp speeches will fall in that 7 to 9 range, and great extempers can deliver a speech with 9+ sources and have adequate, accurate source information. And there's some tricks I've taught my extempers over the year for how to remember those sources and how to get not hung up on them so much. Because I know that that does seem daunting when students first start Extemp. Questions about Extemp?
You guys are easy.
I know, they really are. This is also my next favorite event, is impromptu. All of them are my favorite. And when I teach this to my kids, this is what I say too, and they start laughing by the 3rd or 4th event. So we do it different than how it's done at nationals and how it's done in college in Kansas. So in Kansas, you go to typically a draw table. Occasionally a tournament will have you draw in the classroom. You don't have a scheduled draw time because a lot of people that do impromptu also do Extemp, and that would make it incredibly hard to schedule those. So it's kind of, they show up at a table and they draw their topic, and then someone marks that they've started, and they make sure that they don't overlap with someone else in that same room. Those topics are random and typically divided by rounds. So round 1 might be quotations. Round 2 might be idioms. Round 3 might be parables. So it'll just depend based on what the tournament does. And you draw those 3 topics, you choose one, and you have 5 minutes to prepare a 5-minute speech using no notes. So you can consult the internet or consult files if you happen to have them. I don't think anyone carries around impromptu files, but you can, as you're structuring that speech, consult the internet. I will say that my students that are good at impromptu, we have developed, I have them do a sheet, which is what I did when I was in college. We pick things that the students are really familiar with. So if they have read a book and they know that book really well, and they know what all the possible themes for that book are, and they know what the characters are, then they will write down on a prep sheet, I am an expert on Wicked, and these are all of the themes that are inherent in Wicked that I can relate to a topic that I draw. Here are some quotations that I thought were important. Here's the main storyline of Wicked. And so we script those out, and we have students come up with about 10 things that they put in their impromptu prep folder. And then when they draw a topic, most of the time you're going to want to treat the topic like it's a metaphor. So if it's an idiom or a parable or an object, you want to make it a metaphor for something greater that has a deeper meaning. If it's a quotation, you can agree with the quotation, you can disagree with the quotation, or you can talk about the person who said the quotation. You have 3 options depending on how much knowledge you have about the topic. And so I think one of the reasons why I like impromptu is because my actors that do impromptu are just as good as my speakers that do impromptu, and they do it in 2 totally different ways. And so my actors tend to do it a little bit more interpy. They talk more about lighthearted topics and examples. My speakers take it more seriously and do it a little bit more like it's extemp, where they're talking about serious themes. But same structure. You're going to have an introduction. You're going to state the topic. You're going to state the quotation. You're going to agree with it, disagree with it, explain what the metaphor is, and preview 2 or 3 main reasons to prove that your analysis is correct. And then you'll have a short conclusion that looks a lot like a good introduction in reverse, where you review what the topic is, review your main points, and then you tie us back to whatever you used as your attention getter and leave us with a lasting thought. It's an easy third event for kids to do, you know, and fun for them to try. And most of the kids on my team will try it, and a lot of them like it. Questions about impromptu?
When you say a third event, is triple entering? Is that a pretty typical thing to do?
This is a whole new world. So at most tournaments, you can do 2 events plus impromptu. Impromptu kind of counts as a third. If you go to some smaller tournaments, they're still pretty strict on the 2 events only. If you go to my tournament, you can enter as many events as you can get to in an hour and a half or 2 hours, however long my rounds are. And that just depends. I know that if you go up to the Kansas City area, a lot of tournaments are that way. In the Wichita area, I believe, Mike, your tournament triple entered is what it used to be. I'd have to remember, but I know that just depends on where you're at and what your neck of the woods is as to how many entries they let you have at a tournament.
I'm all about as many entries as the kid can handle. I use it to leave it to the coach's discretion.
Yep.
And some of the cooler tournaments, I like it where they have like a who can do the most events successfully and
yeah, and we gave at I co-hosted
Crown.
with K-State. Yeah, I co-hosted with K-State last year, and we gave a triathlon award to the top student in 3 events who placed in those 3 events, and we gave those to the top 5 performers. I believe Olathe Northwest does that. So there are a couple tournaments where you can enter more than those 2 events. So it's a whole different world. Although there are some locations where they still limit you to just the 2. And obviously at every tournament, you can never do both extemps, and you can never do IDA plus extemp because those are just impossible to schedule. So unless they would do flighted rounds, which we don't have anyone, I think, that does that anymore. Other questions about impromptu? Okay, so we'll get into IDA. And I always had a lot of kids that wanted to do this event when I taught in the 4A world because it looks really fun. This is also one of the events that is most commonly grieved at the state tournament. It's also one of the events that has the most injuries out of any tournament. I had to stop around once because we were in like a wood shop and the floor was cement, and a kid did like a death drop and the head just smacked the cement and bounced up off of it, and then the kid couldn't stand up. after they hit their head on the cement. So it's a wild world sometimes in IDA. But this is for kids that like to improvise, like to create scenes and put them together. They will have a draw room. It's typically a gymnasium at whatever tournament you're at. They obviously have a partner, and it's 4 minutes minimum, 7 minutes maximum. And this one does have an official minimum time limit in the state rules. So if you're under time, there's a penalty, just like if you're overtime, there's a penalty. So they will go to the draw room and they're going to draw 3 characters and choose 2. They're going to draw 3 situations and choose 1. And then they're going to draw 3 locations and choose 1. In terms of characters, situations, and locations, the only regulation or restriction is that they can't be proper nouns, or like, you can't have like Arnold Schwarzenegger, but you could have like acting former governor of California, or of a state, because you wouldn't say California. But you could have characteristics of that person that would give a person an indication that they're similar to that person. Then you get 30 minutes to prepare, and you want to create a scene that has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and a plot. One thing in IDA is that you cannot play multiple characters. You have to play the character that you were drawn. And that does not mean you can't be creative. I know that there was a team, my last year in 4A, that got grieved in the final round. Their character was a zombie, and they ate the brain of the other character and then took on characteristics of the other character, which I thought was very creative and clever, and not playing another character. And that grievance wasn't upheld because they did say that that was perfectly fine under the rules, that play another character. So you want to create that full story. The characters can touch, they can interact, they can have blocking, they can use a table and 2 chairs. Again, they can't stand on the table, lay on the table, any of that sort of thing. And then they will have an introduction that's typically about 30 seconds to a minute, where the most creative IDA teams will have named their performance that they put together. And they might just be like, here is Ships on the Moon by, and then they'll go back into the scene. Most of them will do what Mr. Tidwell talked about earlier, a teaser, where they start off acting for about 30 seconds to a minute, and then they'll fade into the introduction, and then they'll go back into the piece. I will also say that I've seen some really good IDAs. I know it gets a really bad rap, but I've seen some really good IDAs. And there are a couple schools in my neck of the woods right now that their students do serious IDAs, and holy cow, they're good. Because most of the time kids want to do this because they can jump around and be loud, and they think they can do like Saturday Night Live type comedy and slapstick sketchy type stuff, and not really have a full storyline that's being told or upheld throughout, or they don't have a resolution to it. But there are some schools that do this that are phenomenal at doing it, and they teach plot theory, and some of them tell their kids to do serious and not always humorous, and man, they're phenomenal. Questions about IDA?
Everything she just said is absolutely true. I make fun of IDA more than anybody probably, but when it was a 6A event a long time ago, we took it really seriously. We taught kids how to build a story. We taught them about stock characters. It can be really well done.
Yeah, I was telling Mr. Tidwell when we talked about this presentation and who was going to talk about IDA, I was like, well, I can because I lived it for a very long time. But also my first state champion, embarrassingly enough, was in IDA. So
we have the honor of having the final co-state champions in IDA, and there's a whole story. But I think we killed IDA in 6A.
So if, as a 5A school, this isn't one of my events, I'd assume that my team should not be entering this because they would be taking a state qualification.
So here's what I know a couple of schools who are 5A that still like the IDA have done. I believe, and I think Sherry would be okay with me saying her name, Sherry Stroh, when she was at Goddard, she would tell kids that if they were already state qualified in their main events, then they could do IDA as an event. But if they made finals, they were to throw the final round. They did not take state qualification spots
Yeah, I
kind
think,
of have the same thing. I tell my kids if they're double state qualified in their events, then they can do IDA at a tournament, but we shouldn't in the final round try to take the qualification spots. We should just have fun with it.
I think it's
Mr.
really
Tip-
bad. I tend to think it's pretty bad form to take qualifications away from people who.
Yeah.
Now it's worth noting that your kids can do it at festival. So I mean, it's not a 6A event or a 5A event, but if you have a team that qualifies for state festival and you're not gonna do champs or they're not gonna be on your state championship team, they can do that. I just can't see the point in taking away. Out here, it would just be another reason for small schools to hate us because we're big. So
Yeah, and I think the only time we've done IDA in the last couple of years is when they needed a filler team.
that's the
And
only
I
time
did-
we do it.
Yeah, I just threw some kids in and said, go make something up real quick and be terrible.
There are 5 IDA teams. It's not going to qualify anybody for state unless somebody steps in, and nobody else will do it. So we'll throw a couple of kids in.
I got you. Well, and being at a Catholic school, I don't need any more reasons for somebody to dislike. There's plenty. So.
Yeah.
Okay. Very good.
Other questions about IDA or any of the events or anything we've mentioned? Y'all have been so good.
You have been good. You've let us go really, really way too fast. Of course, I suppose it helps a little bit that you're both reasonably familiar with. We have a new Sherry. When did you hop in? I just noticed that we have another person in. Maybe not.
Maybe not.
All right, I think I'll stop the recording. Mike, do you have anything you want to say before I stop the recording?
No, you can stop the recording. I was just gonna say thank you to both Russ and Megan